what's being told and what's not being told, and how that's being communicated or not being communicated. And ultimately, what does that reveal about God? And also, then what does that reveal about Samson as a judge as well? So, we were briefly introduced to the character of Samson in chapter 13. To sum it up briefly and succinctly, you can say that great expectations are to be had from Judges chapter 13. This is a miracle birth. This is a supernatural promise that's been given by God to Manoah and his wife about the promise of the coming son, a savior, not a capital S, but a lowercase s savior, a deliverer for the people of Israel, who were at that time under the pressure of who? Of the Philistines. Of the Philistines. And it is so special of an incident that is chapter 13. Who showed up before Manoah and his wife? The angel of the Lord, aka known as Christ. The pre-incarnate Christ, showed up to deliver this prophecy to Manoah and his wife, to explain to them that they can expect a great savior, a deliverer to come from her womb, from the wife's womb. And on top of that, what is also further revealed about Christ in this specific chapter? What was he to be called? His name is Wonderful. And the definition of wonderful then is also can be translated as indescribable. It is so beyond our imagination and what we can fathom of who God is. He is so beyond that. He's indescribable. And his very name, in essence, is wonderful. And all that he does are wonders. And it's a great thing for us to meditate and think through carefully. So this great anticipation and expectation and this great excitement is planted for us in chapter 13. Then you see at the end of chapter 13, verse 24, the woman gave birth to a son and named him Samson. And what was Samson's name? What is, or not his name? What is the meaning of his name? Little son, right? A little son, a sunny boy. And the child grew up, and the Lord blessed him specifically by giving him what? Strength. Very, very supernatural strength. Okay, very strong. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him in Mahanath Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. And now we pick up in chapter 14, the very first incident that we see in Samson's life that we are privy to. And for our title for this judge's lesson is actually the worst wedding ever. So think in your head for just a brief moment, how many weddings you've attended over the course of your lifetime, and consider, you don't have to share it verbally out loud, but consider mentally, think of the worst wedding you've ever attended. I know it's kind of sad. But you probably may have one or two that pop in your mind where it was not at all God honoring or glorifying, or maybe a lot of alcohol involved and a lot of inappropriate items throughout that wedding as well of varying degrees. Think of that, but now consider the chapter that we're about to launch and start in Samson's life in Judges chapter 14. This is probably like 10 times worse than what you could imagine at the moment, and given today's standard and context. So this is going to be the worst wedding ever, and it only gets better because in chapter 15, our next Judges lesson, it's going to be the worst marriage ever that you get to experience as well. So this guy, something to look forward to, not necessarily in a positive light of the great anticipation that's been built up from chapter 13, but quite the contrary, it's quite negative of an experience into Samson's life. Yet the beauty behind these chapters is we still get to see God working. We still get to see God working and saving and delivering the people of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. So that's what's fun, because by having the worst wedding and the worst marriage ever, over 1,000 Philistines were slaughtered by Samson. Over 1,000 Philistines were slaughtered in these two chapters. So with that, there's going to be quite a fun dialogue that we are to be had in this particular lesson. Very quickly, I want you to gather in groups of maybe 4 to 5 people, and people sitting next to you. And we have a task today. The person or the group who can come up with whatever the prompt is in just a second, you will all receive a free copy of a Puritan paperback. Okay, so the 4 to 5 individuals who get to do that and who get to come up with a list of, I'll give it to you right now, the most amount of wrong thinking patterns in this chapter. I know everything is just going bad to worse at this point. Okay, the most amount of bad, wrong thinking patterns that is listed in these 20 verses, you will get a copy, okay, of your choice of a Puritan paperback. Okay, so form your groups now of 4 to 5 people. I'll give you a quick second to discuss amongst yourselves who you want to be in your group, and who will fight alongside with you to get these books.
You can get a huge list. We're gonna get a book.
Okay. And since now you're already forming your groups, let me give you your first task. In verses 1 to 4, the first breakdown of our outline, the Lord's secrets. Okay. In the first 4 verses, highlight as many as you can within your own group the wrong thinking patterns that exist within these 4 verses. And they cannot repeat. Okay. So try to be as specific but as distant of a thinking pattern as you can. Okay. So you can't say like, oh, they have a wrong thinking pattern of marriage. Oh, they have a wrong thinking pattern of relationship. Like that won't fly as well. Okay. So as many as you can. Yes, you can start discussing that now since you already have your groups. First 4 verses. First 4.
Like satisfying. Make
Yeah.
And this first 4. If you don't need the first 4, I saw 2. One is the fact that
Yeah, but I think it's also just like using
yeah.
No honor from
You guys know.
What do you think?
You have about a minute left with the first 4 verses. As many wrong thinking patterns as you can identify.
Samson's idea was to have bring down the Philistines because they were like really Is that like a
Using this as like marriage to get to
I mean, yeah, it's like if they're using like kind of like as a tool rather than
30 seconds.
Wait, is the key work the Lord?
Oh, the Philistines. I'll get like wait, so Samson had
Alrighty, so let's go ahead and look through the first 4 verses real fast. Again, this entire chapter centers itself around secrets. And the cool thing in this first portion of the chapter, in the first 4 verses, we're reviewed to a secret of the Lord. that the audience, and specifically the people at play here, Samson and his parents, and even the woman and Timnah, they're not aware of the Lord's working behind the scenes. Okay, so we're first and foremost introduced to the Lord's secret. We'll get to that in just a second. But before that, there are plenty of wrong thinkings that already exist in the first 3 verses alone. So, honor system, really fast, just to get an accurate amount. How many of you have identified maybe 2 wrong thinking patterns? At least 2. How many of you have identified 3, 4, 5, 6? So 5, 6. Okay, 5-ish. 5 or more. 5 or more. One more time. 5 or more. 5 or more. Okay, so it's a heated competition. Excuse me. I was so excited, my voice cracked a little bit. So with that, for the groups that are behind a little bit, don't worry. There's 3 more other sections, plenty for you to dive into. But honor system, as you share out your wrong thinking patterns, please do not add to your already existing list for counting for points. But you can obviously add them in to make sure you're still engaged and interacting with the text itself. So let's quickly go through the wrong thinking patterns that you've identified, then we'll go through the passage and we'll move on to the next portion. Okay, so which group wants to start this first? Wrong thinking patterns.
Yeah.
Yes, Aaron, go ahead. Just one at a time, We'll run and rotate through.
Okay.
Yeah.
Intermarriage.
Intermarriage, specifically. Good, excellent, good. So that's wrong thinking pattern there, that somehow Samson thinks it's okay to marry a Philistine woman. Next. Shout it out. I know you got them on your list already. No need to raise your hand. Just go.
There's a Philistine woman living in Timnah, which means there's intermixing not just of marriage, but of people.
Excellent in observation in that as well. The Philistines were not completely driven out, so they're coexisting and cohabitating with the Philistines as well in Timnah, which is part of the land of Canaan, the promised land. Okay, good. What else? Yes, Bernard.
Samson's lust.
It looks good to me.
Yes. Okay, there's a lustful component that's purely motivated by lust, but rather than actual love. That's good. What else?
No honor for parents.
There's no honor for parents. How do you know that?
So usually the parents decide choose a bride for his son, but then he sees someone and he's like, "Go get her for me."
Yeah, you can look at how rude he is to his parents. No, go get her for me. That's it. End of story. Okay, so that's good. That's 4 so far. Anything else that you guys see potentially as well? Yes, Jihan.
He has no initiative and he makes his friends go get his
Oh, no initiative whatsoever. But then you do have to take into consideration a little bit of the culture as well. So what do you think? Is it a valid or invalid of an observation? Think Abraham and Isaac. Abraham sent a servant to grab a wife. So, valid or invalid of an observation?
But to parents, it's like a story.
Explain a little bit.
Like if you're a son asking for something and there's like a slave that you can ask, then there's authority and then or higher power. But then if you have parents, then I think at least with the tone that we think context is coming from.
Or can you say rather it's actually showing a lot of initiative because he went up, parents, go get her for me. It's not like I don't know what to do with my life. I don't know if I want a wife. He knows he wants a wife, not a good one. He took the initiative to act upon it. Would that be valid or invalid then?
Say unwise initiative.
Unwise initiative. There's unwise initiative. So now we're saying there are initiatives. He is taking initiative. Okay. All right. So we're pretty easy to sway here. We'll keep playing that game the rest of this chapter and the many chapters to come in the book of Judges. Okay. So I'll let you consider that, whether or not that is wrong thinking or not, in that specific principle of taking initiative. Okay. And you're more than welcome to add on. We can come back to it later on as well. But something else fun though. Okay. Let's since we're already in this discussion mode, before we dive into the context a little bit more, verse 4, his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Now, in your version of the Bible, who is the he reference to? God, right? So a lot of it, yours is capitalized. It's also a nice little debate that can be had that this he can actually be a lowercase he referring to. Samson is the one who is orchestrating this entire thing to get at the Philistines. Do you agree or disagree with this new interpretation that's been given to you? Is it the Lord's way or is it Samson's way of orchestrating this pursuit of a Philistine woman in order to go against the Philistines? The silence asks for more time for discussion. So quick 2 minutes for you to discuss amongst your groups. What is the correct understanding of the he in verse 4? Is it God who is seeking or is it Samson who's seeking an occasion against the Philistines? 2 minutes, quick answer, go. And why?
I mean, kind of need, like, did Samson
It seems like he really wants a wife. I mean, he goes there in person, saw a woman, goes back to his parents.
I mean, he did specify that.
So if it was, like, he was Samson, he would be like scheming. It seems like the previous verses, at least from the context, can make more sense. Like, just not a
I mean, that the Lord was seeking an occasion.
Not sure. I guess it doesn't really.
It would make sense if the Lord was seeking for an occasion.
Alrighty, so really quickly then in verse 4, what is our conclusion in evaluating who that he is? How many of you say that this is reference to God? How many of you are thinking this is in reference to Samson? Okay, so no one. Let's hear it. Why? How do we know? Yes, Nathaniel, go ahead.
So I was just looking at the word right before it, between, it was the occasion alert for he was and specifically, feeling like for is like usually indicating it was kind of reliant or it was connected with the previous thought. And so since it was talking about, the Lord is the one who's behind this, it was of the Lord. So it should follow that it was talking about him.
Excellent. So grammatically, it makes sense that the he, the closest noun that is seeking to describe or to replace would be the Lord. Okay. Additionally, contextually, how do we know that's also not Samson's motive? Yes.
In verse 1 to 2, you see that Samson's motivation for the woman is lust, his own lust, and not like thinking about God's plan.
That's really excellent observation, right? Just think about the pure motive aspect of it from what's already revealed to you in the first 3 verses is completely driven by his own selfish ambitions. It's driven by lust. There is no desire whatsoever in thinking about what the Lord wants. In fact, that is going to become very evident in the rest of this chapter. In chapter 14, you'll realize, Samson, do you really care about what God's plan is? Or do you really care about what he says at all whatsoever? Unfortunately, that would be a question that comes up quite a lot in this life. Okay, so it's fitting though, because it's going to build into application point, into challenging us to consider, do you actually really care and live out God's plan for your life? Or are you also just as ignorant, if not more, than Samson? And then how does that play out in our lives as well? So it's actually pretty interesting, fascinating to note. But let's jump into the first 4 verses a little bit more in detail. So Samson went down to Timnah. So previously, he was located in Zorah, right? That's where his parents are from. That you also see in the previous verse, in verse 25 of chapter 13. He traveled down to Timnah. And if you were to look on the map, Zorah and Timnah and their relationship with each other is Zorah is 8 miles east of Timnah. Okay, 8 miles east. So you're traveling closer to the coastal regions. So you're traveling westward to get to Timnah, about 8 miles of a walk, of a hike. And the reason for why Scripture says, verse 1, went down, not necessarily south in direction, but going down because Zorah is more located in a mountainous region. So you're going down from the hills, okay, to more of a flat surface level city, Timnah. And then there he saw a daughter, okay, of the Philistines. Verse 2, he came back and told his father and mother, I saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. Now, therefore, get her for me as a wife. In this now, I would talk a little bit about what Jihan and the group has mentioned a little bit. The lack of initiative, I think it is to a degree valid, okay? Because there are oftentimes other saints of old in the Old Testament who did not rely on, for example, parents to get them a spouse, such as, I think Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, okay? And then you think additionally, then also who else? Ruth oftentimes took her own initiative, okay? Obviously at the urging of Naomi, but then at the same time is still on her doing and her acts for Boaz as well. So there's plenty of other examples as well. And the reason why I say that is because we'll find out later on as well in chapter 14, Samson is very much so at this point in his life still a mama's boy. To the degree, you're going to see that really clearly once we get into his understanding of relationship a little bit better later on as well. So I think it is a valid point. It is a wrong thinking pattern of lacking initiative to a degree as well. Okay, so with that, let's continue on jumping a little bit further. And now at this point, and after verse 2, you're thinking all sorts of, red flags are popping up to you. Like, what is going on here? In which this is the chosen deliverer of God, yet his thinking is completely bonkers and haywire. Because you look back to chapter 13, it's so promising. What vow was he told he should abide by? Which vow? The Nazarite vow, which is show to what is it meant to serve as? Why do people make the Nazarite vow? Dedication and devotion to the Lord, to the wholehearted degree, right? And so much so that what are some of the restrictions of someone who take on the Nazarite vow? Detailed earlier in chapter 13, or if you want to reference back to Numbers chapter 6, what can't they do? They can't cut their hair. That's the most famous one. No strong drinks or grapes, anything from the vine. Can't touch dead bodies, and they can't allow any of the family members as well to be defiled in any way possible, right? So it's very restricted and limited, not necessarily because, God doesn't want them to do anything, but it's all part of displaying and exemplifying that devotion and commitment to the Lord. Yet here, immediately, you already see there's defilement, right? There's defilement in his mind already in thinking that intermarriage, for some reason, is okay and acceptable in God's eyes. And unfortunately, in the latter half of the book of Judges, everyone is already doing what was right in his own eyes. So this is already ingrained in Samson's mind. This is what's right according to the culture that I'm surrounded with and what's right in my eyes. Therefore, it makes perfect sense according to his logic and his own reasoning that she saw a woman that was good and went after her to pursue her as a wife. But this is not just the breaking of Nazarite vow. This is just breaking of just what it means to be an Israelite. We have to understand how severe and grave this type of request is being made from Samson. The Lord does not take lightly whatsoever with intermarriages. What did he do with Ezra and Nehemiah in their time? Because of the abundance of intermarriages with the Gentiles and the pollution of the Israelites' line. What do?
Mass divorce.
It's a mass divorce. It's not something to be taken lightly of whatsoever. And what do we know about God and his view on divorce? He hates it, absolutely. But it's such an extreme case that extreme measures have to be taken, even though it was not at all what the Lord intended and desired to do whatsoever. Yet somehow it has ingrained into Samson's mind that this is okay. This is okay. And you would think that at a young age, he's probably been told by his parents the great prophecy that has been revealed to you and the great calling you've been set aside for by God to be a chosen deliverer for the people of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Yet here you are blatantly disobeying God as though he does not exist. How is that okay? Driven completely by lust, completely by the eyes and what he sees in front of him in verse 3, right? The father and mother had some sense to them. Is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you should go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? Now, pause for a second. Does this reveal any wrong thinking pattern within the parents?
I mean, they should have shut it down right there. Like, remind him of God's purpose for him.
Where is the focus on the Lord? And as Nathaniel is completely correct in verse 3, where is the discussion of God and his holiness and of his standards and of his commands that we ought to be obedient to, not just a mere proposed suggestion? Hey, have you considered one of our own instead of taking a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? Right off the bat, verse 3 wouldn't necessarily be the way that you want to go about parenting per se. But then again, how do you weigh that between a grown man who wants to do what is right? But is there a pressure imposed by the parents that can still be in effect to someone who is a grown offspring, to a grown son, to urge him to follow the Lord, to be obedient to the Lord, no matter the cost, whatever the circumstance, stick to what God's word says? But again, it's not just what they tell him, but it's more of what they fail to tell him. That's also revealing of potential wrong thinking patterns there as well in verse 3. But as you have also highlighted the second half of verse 3, Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, for she looks good to me." Well, it's all about just the appearance, about the outward. Thankfully in RGC, even in our past Flame series and various different dating relationship talks and discussions and lessons, what should Samson instead be focused on? Beyond just the outward appearance. Character, 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 and character, and character. But gentlemen, is that how we operate? Ladies, is that how we operate? It's good in one sense for us to be able to identify it in Samson's life, but it's a whole nother ball game when it comes to examining our own lives. Maybe perhaps for us, it's not the physical appearance and attraction that draws us immediately. But what about the personality? What about just the idea of us getting along really, 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 really well? And for us to have the same type of humor, same type of hobbies and interests and activities that we love doing together. That oftentimes, though, more often than not, we're tempted to prioritize those more than actual character of the individual that we're seeking to go on a date with, to identify whether or not he or she really is God's best. You see, the word for good here, it's to please. It's pleasing to him. Just by looking at her, give her a lot of fulfillment and pleasure and pleasing. To him, what's fulfilling in life is just gratifying the desires of the flesh. Now let's pause for a second and think beyond just relationships and what our standards are and what our expectations when it comes to finding our future spouse, but consider just what drives us in life. You see, this is in one sense a revealing of the heart of lust in Samson, but it's also a revealing of the heart of Samson in his direction in life. What are you hoping to satisfy and fulfill you in life? Because unlike Samson, you can say, well, I'm not driven by lust in my pursuit of relationships, but you could very well still be fulfilled and driven by the very fact that you want your own flesh to be gratified and to be satiated and to be satisfied. On a day-by-day basis, we have to ask ourselves the question, what drives you? Just so you can feel to be a better person, so you can do good things based on your own merits? Or is there a genuine and humble and a sincere desire to honor the Lord, to please the Lord, and to go the direction that he points towards? this perhaps is Samson's greatest failure that we see in his entire narrative in his life. There's a failure to really allow the Lord and his great calling drive him to being of effectiveness for the Lord rather than just constantly going about doing what he wants. Because the next couple of chapters, you see God working, but you also see Samson working, just doing whatever he desires under the sun. Whatever sees right in his eyes, he wants to do. And that's a tragic way to live. But all in all, while we're given this unfortunate, imperfect Savior that's been introduced to us in chapter 14 with such great promise of chapter 13, now we experience the disappointments in chapter 14. Yet here, to ground us in our confidence in the Lord, to have security in him, is in verse 4. However, it changes the mood. It changes the tone completely with just this simple word. However, the father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Now, at the time, the Philistines were ruling over Israel. You see, God is still in control. And that's perhaps one of the key points that I really want us to understand in Judges chapter 14 is you can do whatever you want in life. And you think to yourself, you know, I'm my own man, I'm my own woman, whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, the plan of the Lord, the will of the Lord will be accomplished in your life, whether you like it or not. The Lord is still completely sovereign and able to cause all things for his glory, for the exaltation and the magnification of his Son, of Christ. God is constantly behind the scene working. And we think back even as reflection in times in which we wandered alone and wander off away from doing what's right in God's eyes, but we kind of indulge ourselves in fleshly desires and fleshly sins. Nonetheless, we can always look back with gratefulness and with thankfulness that God was still at work, even in the times in which we were a bit wayward from our own temptations and sins. God has not abandoned us. God has not abandoned the people of Israel in this specific chapter, and God has not abandoned Samson. What a mighty comfort it is in which we see the Lord's secret given to us. And now we have to ask ourselves the question as we march through this chapter, what is God's plan in this specific situation? That started off wrong and continues to be wrong and ends in a disaster. How is God going to bring to fruition his perfect, unchanging plan to still seek an occasion against the Philistines and use Samson as a mighty deliverer, though a flawed and imperfect savior, still deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines? So then moving on, then you see verses 5 to 9. Now we are introduced to Samson's secret. We're made known to the Lord's secret in verses 1 and 4. Now Samson's secret in verses 5 through 9. So let's go ahead and go back. Let me read that for us first, and then we can go back in about 2-3 minutes, highlight as many wrong thinking patterns as you can pinpoint. Starting in verse 5, Samson went down to Timnah and with his father and mother, and came as far as the vineyards of Timnah, and behold, a young lion came roaring towards him. Now, do you normally just expect a lion to just come out of vineyards? Probably not, okay? So verse 6, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so that he tore him as one tears a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done. So he went down and talked to the woman, and she looked good to Samson. When he returned later to take her, he turned aside to look at the carcass of the lion. And behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the body of the lion. Now, is that also normal? No. So he scraped the honey into his hands and went on, eating as he went. When he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them, and they ate it. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey out of the body of the lion. So you realize nothing happening in these verses is ever normal. It's all supernatural. And now let's consider what's wrong in these set of verses. In these 5 verses, what are the wrong thinking patterns? Have fun. You have 3 minutes.
Oh, that's true. Going to doing what he did or something. Yeah.
Well, 7 is the same. It's just not looking at principal or a character or someone.
So telling your
Yeah,
parents
that one
everything
was.
is
But then he would turn back.
Honey from the side. Is there something erotic?
Gravity returning. I don't know if that's
Was the line like there for a long time? Because he returned. Returned late. Like I would assume that the bees were not there initially.
Yeah.
Otherwise he was gonna.
So it had something to do with
I wonder if it's
causing that.
You have about a minute left. Sorry, we gotta fly through it a little bit faster. About a minute left to go through these verses. What went wrong?
I don't know. You eating honey from that side of your line that you instead of like being weirded out by it, just like starting eating. I don't know. I wouldn't eat strange food.
Happy to start it.
Why he eating the gross honey?
Okay, so the talking has kind of quieted down a little bit. Let's go ahead and get back together then. Trust that you were able to grab a couple of good wrong thinking patterns that exist with this particular chapter. And as you're still thinking, just still jot down some notes if you would like. But turn your attention to Numbers chapter 6. Turn with you to Numbers chapter 6 real fast. Numbers chapter 6. Here we are introduced to the Nazirite vow. And I want to read for us specifically, starting from verse 3 to verse 7. If you find any additional wrong thinking patterns, you're more than welcome to add it into your wrong thinking list, and we'll count that as points later on. So, starting in verse 3, specifically talking about what the Nazirite vow entails. He shall abstain from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar, whether made from wine or strong drink, nor shall he drink any grape juice, nor eat flesh or dried grapes. All the days of his separation, he shall not eat anything that is produced by the grapevine, from the seeds even to the skin. All the days of his vows of separation, no razor shall pass over his head. He shall be holy until the days are fulfilled, for which he separated himself to the Lord. He shall let the locks of hair on his head grow long. All the days of his separation to the Lord, he shall not go near a dead person. He shall not make himself unclean for his mother or for his father, for his brother or for his sister when they die, because his separation to God is on his head. All the days of his separation, he is holy to the Lord. So, feel free to shout it out. Wrong thinking patterns that exist in verses 5 to 9. Let's hear it.
When the lion attacks him, he doesn't seek the Lord and depends on his own strength to kill the lion.
Okay, depending on his strong strength, but how would you explain then verse 6? The Spirit of the Lord came upon him finally.
I think that speaks more to God's province than his own actual act asking for it.
Yeah. Well, do you think then Samson grew up thinking, wow, I'm just naturally really strong? At a young age of 5, I can deadlift 400 pounds. You know, just natural for any 5-year-olds to just deadlift that much. Right? Quentin's like, yeah, I deadlift that much, 400 easy. Well, do you think that that's actually of him? Or later on, remember in his death, right? Samson, in this way, he does acknowledge God for what? For his strength. So I wouldn't necessarily conclude that it's necessarily a complete independence from God. I think there is an acknowledgement, understanding that he's been supernaturally gifted with power by God, I would say probably throughout his life, because he probably saw a distinction and separation, like from every other kid on the block. Like, you're not as strong as me, you know, but I can't be a bully, you know. So yeah, so maybe I won't necessarily take that as a wrong thinking pattern. Okay, next. Yes, Thomas.
Just by going to the vineyards, itself is like it's in itself. Like it's just being surrounded by grapes because you know they have a vow that drinking grapes not be able to consume it. But I mean, not consuming it, but it's in the area of it. So maybe it's kind of like dangerous grounds.
Might not be the wisest. Okay. But I think that point though actually gets solidified later on a little bit more. So we're gonna hold that thought. Okay, because I wouldn't say that's necessarily as explicit in this portion of passage, but it's going to be more evident later on. Okay, where it's not just entertaining vineyards, but he's actually probably consuming as well later on. So we'll get to that. So but you can keep that as a point, but not in this passage just yet. That's good, solid. Actually, we can get to that right now. It actually comes immediately in verse 10. Okay, because it's an exciting thing for you to look into, right? His father went down to the woman, and Samson made a feast there, for the young men customarily did this for about a week long. Now, this is where the difference in culture needs to put into perspective understanding. For us, a wedding day is simply just a day. For them, a wedding is normally would last typically anywhere from a couple of days to a whole week, or even at times more if you're really, really rich. Okay, so it's an entire wedding celebration that lasts several days. And in this specific case, in Samson's wedding, how long? It's about 7 days, a week long. Now, the key word here that we want to focus in on verse 10 is the word feast. The word feast can also translate it's to imply there's going to be a lot of alcohol. Okay, there's going to be a ton of alcohol involved in this wedding celebration. A week long of debauchery, of drunkenness, and of immorality is what you're envisioning here, as the Philistines and the young men customarily did this. So then I think is the wrong thinking pattern that you can base it with more evidence, okay, for Thomas's group, and thinking about just breaking of the Nazareth vow and thinking about grapes and wine and strong drinks, okay? So with that, going back to verses 5 to 9, what other wrong thinking patterns are there? Go ahead, Thomas, just keep going.
Just scooping the honey from the carcass of wine, because like the people, they're not supposed to be interacting with dead stuff.
Yeah, and this is not necessarily just pertaining to Nazareth vow. This is just for who? For Israelites in general. Don't touch anything that's unclean. And you're just, scooping honey like it's nothing out of a carcass, of a cadaver. I mean, that's crazy to think about, like honey. I mean, the whole picture that you see here is supernatural to begin with, because what normally would swarm a carcass? Flies and maggots, not bees. You don't expect bees to be there, okay? So that's wrong thinking pattern there. Excellent. What else? Don't let Thomas just steal the cell. What else?
So he doesn't tell his parents, so you don't necessarily have to do it. That's the wrong thinking, but it's definitely the lie of omission, where he doesn't tell anyone about it.
But why? You don't have to tell your parents everything. Yeah. Don't take that in a sinful way, please.
There's clearly something wrong about where he sees all these miraculous things that are obviously from God. So he doesn't attribute it to God in any of his speech or.
Okay, I will take that one. There's a lack of acknowledgement that God is behind all this. Okay, it's a very blatant omission of understanding that God is behind all this. All these supernatural feats that's been happening. There's no mention of God whatsoever. That's true. But why is not telling the parents? Why is that wrong thinking pattern? What does it lead to something else that is actually a sin? Thomas?
It's not consecrated, like the honey is scooped, and it's like his parents consuming it. It's made them unclean.
You're making your parents unclean as well, because the parents are also Israelites. Nothing unclean. Don't touch anything. Don't eat anything that came from anything unclean. So he's just not caused himself to break the commandments of what the God's law says require the Israelites to be obedient to him, to be set apart, to be holy. But he's also caused his parents unknowingly to also sin as well. All right, so this is not minor at all whatsoever. Anything else that you guys are able to spot and identify? Anything else?
He satisfies hunger over eating.
Okay, good. There's a value over, again, what's of fleshly motivations than what's actually thinking about discerning of what the spiritual consequences are going to be as well. So bigger, broader principle. That's also excellent to hit on. Thank you, Aaron, as well. Yes, Michelle.
Well, it was just kind of like saying the same thing, but I was kind of saying like the phrase like his God is his belly. Like that is his God. It's not God.
Yeah. Yeah. It's quite excellent, right? And in fact, I would even take it a step further. His God are his eyes. Is whatever his eyes are satisfying and pleasing him, whatever is pleasant to him, right? Same thing with a woman, and now same thing with now honey. Whatever is pleasing to him, he's just gonna grab and take. And it probably makes sense for a young boy who's grown up really, really strong. No one will ever say no to you. Not necessarily to imply anything negative of his character, but you can just imagine the childhood is rather pleasant and easy. Everything was kind of most likely given to him because he's also the prophecy child, right? And then Leon, now notice you also raise your hand as well.
I don't think he's supposed to be talking to a single woman by himself, culturally.
Culturally speaking, I don't think that is necessarily ill intent or sinful in that way. Yeah, so I don't think that would be a valid one either. Okay, so verses 5 but all right, yes, Aaron.
No, and not just touching the dead body, but the fact that you went near it. So that's what the Nazarite vow. So the curiosity, I killed this thing like a little while ago.
Yeah. Nazarite vow specifies as the dead person. Do you think it applies here? Number 6. This is a dead person.
It's not a person.
It's not a person. That is not a person. So is he breaking any Nazarite vows here specifically? He's broken a lot of other commandments that God has. We're not exposed to the drinking just yet. That's coming later. But at this given point in time, yes.
Maybe not. Maybe he just kind of thinks he's a little bit like above the law, maybe. And then he also is like kind of like dancing around the boundary, maybe like, oh, how close can I get to breaking it? It's not a person, so.
Yeah, because I think if you look back in Numbers chapter 6, the specific thing here that's mentioned, verses 6 to 7, though near a person not make himself unclean for his mother or his father, for his brother or for his sister when they die, meaning even if the family relative were to die, he can't what? He can't touch them. But the purpose, though, is to make himself unclean. Now, does touching a dead carcass make him unclean? Yes, it does. Okay. Now, this is to show you the extent. The Nazarite vow. This is where you have to understand what the purpose of it is, to show the extent of devotion and commitment. Right. You don't go near a dead person, not even your own family member when they die, because that's a type of cleanliness you ought to present yourself to the Lord. Which means any other lesser and inferior uncleanliness probably means you should stay away from and take seriously of. Okay, so in that sense, I would say it actually is breaking of the Nazarite vow already. That's seen here. Does that help? Okay, so just to clarify a little bit more. Okay, let's move on for the sake of time. Verses 10 to 18. This is now you are introduced to the wedding feast, the week long of drinking, of debauchery, of drunkenness, of just gluttony as well, and of various different sensual pleasures being satisfied left and right. Okay, that's not at all a good picture of a wedding. Okay, but for us then to dive into, for the sake of time, we're going to ask you to read that on your own within yourselves, verses 10 to 18. Identify as many wrong thinking patterns as you can in these set of 9 verses. Okay, starting in verse 10 to the 18. You may begin. I think the juicy parts really come in starting in verse 15. The previous verse is more setting up for you to understand the context of the wedding feast. We're going to drill down deeper in verse 15 and onward.
Samson's wife saying despite these efforts, she
And then the wrong thinking pattern is not only restricted to Samson, but everyone can be opened up in close examination. Wrong thinking patterns, even by his wife.
They also, this like, they're like, well, I mean, that's like, I mean, it's just, that's not even emotional. No, you're highlighting that we will bring up. Yeah. Yeah. What do you think? More than one. 15, yeah. Thank you. You had a problem with my iPhone, you do not have that number. It's a random event. I call it the one that's a specific type of very unique.
no, but it's one that's like it's consecrated as a different field real.
I'll give you about 2 more minutes to highlight as many as you can. 2 more minutes.
So he figures out that underneath the fact is why. That's why I said if you're not the hyper. How are we going? And what